What you are about to hear is not just a story. It is a nightmare that was once hidden behind the walls of one of the most beautiful homes in America. April 10th, 1834, New Orleans, Louisiana. On that quiet, humid spring morning, no one in the French Quarter could have imagined that one of the grandest mansions on Royal Street was about to expose one of the darkest and most disturbing secrets in American history. The day started like any other, until the screams began. Thick black smoke suddenly billowed out from the upper windows of the Lalaurie mansion, a stunning three-story palace painted in elegant shades of white and soft blue. The mansion stood proudly in the heart of the French Quarter, known throughout New Orleans as the crown jewel of high society. Its grand balconies, intricate ironwork, and tall windows made it the envy of every wealthy family in the city. This was not an ordinary house. This was a symbol of wealth, power, and refinement. This was the home of Madame Delphine Lalaurie. At 42 years old, Madame Lalaurie was widely regarded as the most admired, beautiful, and celebrated woman in the entire city. She was rich beyond imagination. Her manners were flawless. Her parties were legendary. She moved through New Orleans high society like a queen, always dressed in the finest silk and lace imported from Paris, always smiling gracefully, always speaking with perfect charm. People fought for invitations to her salons. Gentlemen bowed when she passed. Ladies copied her fashion. Everyone called her elegant, refined, and untouchable. Yet on this fateful morning, that same elegant woman was standing in the middle of Royal Street in an expensive silk gown, her face twisted in panic as she screamed frantically at everyone around her. "Save the furniture! Leave the slaves! Don't touch them! Just save my things!" While her priceless mirrors, crystal chandeliers, antique furniture, and expensive artworks were being dragged out of the burning house, Madame Lalaurie showed absolutely no concern for the human beings still trapped inside. Not one single slave. She only cared about her possessions. But something was terribly, horribly wrong inside that beautiful mansion. In the kitchen, an elderly enslaved woman named Leah, 70 years old, frail and exhausted from a lifetime of service, was chained by her ankle to the heavy iron stove. The flames were growing rapidly, licking at her thin clothes. Smoke filled her lungs. Yet she was not screaming for help. She was not begging anyone to save her, because she had started the fire herself. When two brave men finally forced their way through the smoke and broke into the kitchen, they were stunned by what they saw. The old woman sat calmly amidst the growing flames. Her face showed no panic, only deep exhaustion and quiet resolve. As they rushed to free her from the heavy chain, she looked up at them with tired eyes and whispered words that would shake the entire city. "I started the fire. Better to burn alive than go back to the attic." The two men froze in shock. "What's in the attic?" one of them asked, his voice urgent and trembling. Leah slowly raised her eyes toward the ceiling. Her body was shaking, not from the fire, but from pure terror as she remembered what waited upstairs. In a weak, trembling voice filled with horror, she whispered, "They're still up there. 7 of them. Please, don't let her take them again." That single sentence, spoken by a 70-year-old woman who chose fire over torture, became the spark that would expose hell itself to the entire city of New Orleans. Word of her warning spread like wildfire through the growing crowd that had gathered on the street. Men, some of them free black citizens, others white laborers, began pushing their way into the burning mansion despite Madame Lalarie's furious protests. She tried desperately to block their path, screaming in her refined voice that they had no right to enter her private home, that they were trespassing on her property. But the men did not listen. Driven by the old woman's desperate words, they stormed up the grand staircase, coughing violently through the thick, choking smoke. Their eyes burned. Their lungs felt like they were on fire. Still, they pushed forward until they reached the third floor. At the end of a long, dark hallway stood a heavy wooden door, secured with a thick iron padlock. Even before they opened it, an unbearable stench was already leaking out. A sickening mixture of rotting flesh, dried blood, urine, human waste, and death. The smell was so strong that some of the men gagged and covered their faces. One man grabbed an axe from downstairs. With 3 powerful strikes, the lock shattered and fell to the floor. The moment that heavy door swung open, every man standing there wished with all his heart that it had remained locked forever. Because what they saw inside that attic was not human suffering. It was hell itself. Where are you from listening to this story right now? Drop your country or city in the comments below. And if this story touches your heart even a little, I request you to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these hidden, dark, and forgotten stories from history. Word of Leah's desperate warning spread like wildfire through the growing crowd gathered on Royal Street. "She said there are 7 people still trapped in the attic. Better to burn than go back up there." The words passed from mouth to mouth, from person to person, growing louder and more urgent with every repetition. Men, free black citizens, dock workers, laborers, and even some white men who could no longer ignore the old woman's terror began forcing their way into the burning mansion. They pushed past the thick smoke pouring from the doors and windows. Madame Delphine Lalaurie was furious. She stood in their path like a queen defending her castle, her expensive silk gown now slightly soiled with ash, her face red with rage. She tried to physically block the men with her arms outstretched, screaming in her refined Creole accent, "Stop! You have no right! This is my private property! Leave my house at once! Save my belongings, not those slaves!" Her voice, which had once charmed the elite of New Orleans, now sounded shrill and desperate. But the men did not listen. The terror in Leah's eyes and the horror in her trembling voice had awakened something in them that no amount of shouting from Madame Lalaurie could stop. They rushed forward, coughing violently as thick, choking smoke filled their lungs and burned their eyes. The grand staircase, once used for elegant balls and glittering parties, now felt like a passage into darkness. The heat grew more intense with every step. Pieces of burning wood fell from above. Still, they pushed on. Finally, they reached the 3rd floor. At the end of a long, narrow, and dark hallway stood a heavy wooden door. It was reinforced and secured with a thick, heavy iron padlock. Even from several feet away, an unbearable stench was already leaking out from beneath the door and through the cracks. A sickening, overwhelming mixture of rotting flesh, dried blood, urine, human waste, vomit, and death. The smell was so foul that several strong men gagged and covered their faces with their sleeves. One of the men, a blacksmith named Pierre, grabbed a heavy axe from downstairs. His hands were shaking, not from fear of the fire, but from dread of what they might find behind that door. With 3 powerful strikes, The iron padlock shattered and fell to the floor with a loud clang. For a brief moment, everyone paused. A heavy silence fell. Then the door was slowly pushed open. The moment it swung open, every man standing there wished with all his heart that it had remained locked forever. What they saw inside that attic was not human suffering. It was pure, living hell. The room was dimly lit by a small, dirty window. The air was thick and heavy. 7 enslaved people, 5 women and 2 men, had been turned into broken, mutilated creatures that barely looked human anymore. In the center of the room, a middle-aged woman hung suspended from heavy iron hooks attached to the ceiling beams. Her arms were twisted violently behind her back, both shoulders completely dislocated. Her wrists were raw down to the bone where the ropes had cut deep into her flesh. She was still breathing, but her eyes were completely vacant, as if her mind had escaped her body long ago to survive the pain. To her left, another woman sat slumped against the wall. A thick iron spike as wide as a man's finger had been driven straight through her jaw, locking her mouth permanently open. Flies crawled freely across her tongue and around the wound. Every time she tried to close her mouth in agony, the spike tore deeper into her flesh, causing her whole body to tremble uncontrollably. In the far corner, a man lay on his side in a pool of filth. Both of his legs had been deliberately broken in multiple places. The bones were reset at unnatural, painful angles. His body was covered in a moving carpet of maggots. A large open wound on the back of his head was so deep that the white of his skull was clearly visible through the rotting flesh. The most horrifying sight of all was a young woman who could not have been older than 20. Her belly had been sliced open from side to side. Someone had crudely stitched it back together using thick black thread, the same kind used to repair horse harnesses. The wound was severely infected, swollen, and dark purple. She was still conscious. Every shallow, painful breath she took made her whimper like a wounded animal. All 7 victims wore the same cruel device around their necks, heavy iron collars lined with sharp, inward-facing spikes. If they let their heads drop from exhaustion or pain, the spikes would dig into their throats. They were being forced to remain awake and alert, even in the depths of their torment. The floor was covered in layers of dried and fresh blood, human waste, vomit, and filth. The stench was so powerful that it felt like a physical force pushing against the rescuers' chests. The men stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak. The horror was so overwhelming that it stole their voices. One rescuer, a large and tough man, started crying silently as he moved forward to help lower the woman hanging from the ceiling. No one mocked him. No one said a word. Tears were streaming down several faces as they worked. They began carefully carrying the victims down the grand staircase one by one, their bodies fragile and broken. When the first mutilated person was brought out into the daylight and laid on the cobblestone street, the reaction from the crowd, now over 2,000 people, was explosive. Women screamed in horror. Men cursed and spat on the ground. Some fell to their knees and vomited right there in the street. Mothers covered their children's eyes. And in the middle of this chaos, standing surrounded by her expensive furniture and crystal that had been saved from the fire, stood Madame Delphine Lalaurie. She was still wearing her fine silk gown, her hair perfectly arranged, her face lightly powdered. While her priceless possessions were being protected, she had shown zero concern for the human beings upstairs. Now that her secret was exposed to the entire city, her expression had changed from arrogance to pure, ice-cold fury. She pointed a shaking finger at the rescuers and screamed in her refined voice, "Those are my property. You have no right to touch them. Get out of my house." At that moment, the beautiful mask that Madame Delphine Lalaurie had worn for years finally fell completely. The most admired woman in New Orleans had been exposed. As more and more victims were carefully carried down the grand staircase and laid on the street in broad daylight, the mood of the crowd shifted from horror to something far more dangerous. Pure, uncontrollable rage. The sight of those 7 broken human beings was too much for the people of New Orleans to bear. Men who had lived through wars and hard labor found tears in their eyes. Women screamed in shock and grief. Mothers turned their children's faces away so they would not see the nightmare. Some people fell to their knees right there on the dirty cobblestones, unable to stand. Then the shouting began. "She's a monster! Drag her out here! Make her suffer like she made them suffer! Burn the witch!" The voices grew louder and angrier with every passing minute. The crowd, which had now swelled to nearly 5,000 people, started surging forward like a violent storm. Stones and bricks began flying toward the mansion. Windows shattered. Someone threw a burning piece of wood through a broken window, and new flames started licking at the curtains inside. Doctors and surgeons who had rushed to the scene began examining the victims more carefully. What they discovered next was so disturbing that even the hardest men among them went pale. Every single one of the 7 victims had been pregnant, some of them more than once. Their bodies still carried the signs, but none of them were pregnant anymore. The doctors exchanged grim, silent looks. No one dared speak the words out loud, but the horrific truth hung heavy in the air. What had happened to those unborn children inside that attic? The thought was too terrible to put into words. Meanwhile, a small group of brave men went back upstairs into the smoke-filled attic to search for more evidence. What they found hidden behind a loose wooden panel would shock the entire city. There was a locked chest. When they broke it open, they discovered Madame Lalaurie's private collection of torture instruments, surgical knives of different shapes and sizes, whips with sharp metal tips, branding irons, heavy chains, and several glass jars containing human organs floating in liquid. Teeth, fingers, and pieces of skin were also found carefully preserved. But the most chilling discovery was her private notebook. Written in her beautiful, elegant handwriting, the same graceful script she used to write party invitations and love letters, were page after page of cold, detailed records. She had documented her experiments like a scientist. Dates, names or numbers, descriptions of exactly what she had done to each person, how long they had screamed, how their bodies had reacted, how long they had survived. One entry read, "Subject number 19, removed 3 toes. Subject still responsive after 14 hours. Most fascinating response." Another simply stated, "Subject number 23, sewed lips together, removed stitches after 9 days. Infection set in as expected. Continue observation." One line that made the men reading it feel physically sick said, "Still alive. Continue tomorrow." The men stood there in the burning attic, reading these words written by the same woman who smiled sweetly at balls and church services. Their hands trembled with rage. One of them threw the notebook against the wall and screamed until his voice broke. Another fell to his knees and wept openly. By now, the entire French Quarter had come to a complete standstill. Nearly 5,000 people filled the streets around the Lalaurie mansion. The mob's anger had turned into a living, breathing force. They began destroying everything that belonged to Madame Lalaurie with pure fury. Expensive French furniture was thrown from the second and third floor windows, smashing into pieces on the cobblestones below. Crystal chandeliers worth a fortune were ripped from the ceilings and shattered. Elegant silk dresses imported from Paris were torn to shreds by angry hands. Mirrors were smashed. Paintings were ripped apart. Jewelry boxes were thrown into the street and looted. Some men even started tearing up the wooden floors, searching for more hidden rooms or victims. Others set fire to her belongings right in the middle of Royal Street. Thick black smoke rose high into the sky, mixing with the smoke still coming from the original fire. The beautiful mansion that had once represented elegance and high society was being torn apart before everyone's eyes. But the person they wanted most, Madame Delphine Lalaurie, was already gone. While the furious crowd screamed for her blood and destroyed her home, she and her husband had quietly slipped away through a neighbor's house. They escaped through the narrow back alleys of the French Quarter, running like common criminals. Her once beautiful and expensive silk gown was now torn and covered in mud. Her perfectly styled hair had come undone and hung wildly around her face. The woman who had ruled New Orleans with charm, beauty, and cruelty was now fleeing for her life in terror. They ran desperately until they reached the Mississippi River. There they paid a boatman an enormous amount of gold coins to take them across immediately, no questions asked. As the small boat moved away from the shore into the dark water, Madame Lalaurie looked back at the city she once controlled. She could see the thick black smoke rising from her burning mansion. She could hear the distant roars of thousands of people calling for her death. For the first time in her privileged, powerful life, the fearless Delphine Lalaurie felt true, bone-chilling terror. She would never set foot in New Orleans again. They reached the edge of the Mississippi River just as darkness began to settle over New Orleans. Madame Delphine Lalaurie and her husband, Dr. Louis Lalaurie, were breathing heavily, their fine clothes torn and soaked in sweat and mud. The once elegant queen of high society now looked like a frightened fugitive. Her expensive silk gown, which had cost more than most men earned in a year, was ripped at the hem and stained with dirt from the back alleys she had just run through. They spotted a small fishing boat tied to the dock. The boatman, an old Cajun man, was preparing to leave. Without wasting a single second, Madame Lalaurie stepped forward and offered him a heavy pouch filled with gold coins, far more money than the man would see in several years. "Take us across the river," she demanded, her voice shaking. "Now, no questions." The boatman looked at her disheveled appearance, then at the distant glow of the fire and the roaring mob. He understood. He took the gold without a word and helped them into the boat. As the small vessel pushed away from the shore and moved into the dark, powerful waters of the Mississippi, Madame Lalaurie stood at the back and looked behind her one last time. What she saw would remain burned into her memory forever. Her grand mansion, the symbol of her power, wealth, and status, was engulfed in flames and smoke. Even from the middle of the river, she could see the angry orange glow lighting up the night sky. She could hear the distant roar of thousands of voices screaming for her blood. The mob was destroying everything she had built. For the first time in her entire privileged life, Delphine Lalaurie felt real terror. Not the controlled fear she felt when torturing her victims, not the mild nervousness of social gossip, This was deep, cold, primal terror. The fear of a hunter who had suddenly become the hunted. The woman who had once believed herself untouchable now realized that the city she had ruled with charm and cruelty had turned against her completely. She would never return to New Orleans again. For the next 3 days, the city descended into chaos. The furious mob refused to calm down. They searched every corner of the French Quarter, every alley, every hiding place. They attacked the homes of her relatives and close friends. Her brother-in-law's house was nearly burned to the ground. Several of her acquaintances were dragged into the streets and beaten. Anyone even suspected of helping her escape was threatened. Meanwhile, the 7 survivors were rushed to a charity hospital. The doctors and nurses who treated them were horrified beyond words. The injuries were so severe and so deliberately inflicted that they could barely comprehend how any human being could do such things to another. 3 of the 7 victims died within the first week. Their bodies simply could not recover from the years of torture and the final days of agony in that attic. The remaining 4 survived, but they carried deep physical and mental scars for the rest of their lives. Some could never walk properly again. Others suffered nightmares so severe they would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. They became living proof of Madame Lalarie's cruelty. The story of the Lalaurie horror spread like wildfire across the United States and soon reached Europe. Newspapers in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston printed shocking headlines. Northern abolitionist papers used the incident as powerful ammunition to prove how evil and corrupting the institution of slavery truly was. They wrote long articles describing the torture devices, the notebook, and the pregnant women whose babies had mysteriously disappeared. In the South, many wealthy plantation owners and newspapers tried desperately to deny or downplay the story. Some called it Northern lies or exaggeration by jealous rivals. Others claimed the slaves had injured themselves or that Madame Lalaurie was the real victim of a mob. But the evidence was simply too strong. 7 living victims, torture instruments, jars of organs, and a notebook written in her own handwriting. No amount of denial could erase what had been discovered in that attic. Madame Lalaurie and her husband eventually made their way to Paris, France. There, she lived under a false name for many years, trying to disappear into the crowds of the great European city. Some accounts say she continued her cruel tendencies in secret. Others claim she lived in constant fear, always looking over her shoulder, terrified that someone from New Orleans would recognize her. In 1849, 15 years after the fire, Delphine Lalaurie died in Paris. Official records say she died in a hunting accident, but many people back in New Orleans believed it was divine justice, God's final punishment for the monster who had once walked among them as a queen. Her grand mansion on Royal Street stood abandoned for many years. Over time, it gained a terrifying reputation. Locals began calling it the haunted house. People who walked past it at night claimed they could hear the screams of tortured souls coming from the attic. Some reported seeing ghostly figures in the windows, women with iron spikes in their jaws and men dragging broken legs across the floor. Even today, the Lalaurie Mansion remains one of the most famous haunted locations in America. Tourists from all over the world visit Royal Street just to stand in front of the building and hear this dark chapter of history. Many paranormal investigators still visit, hoping to capture the voices of those who suffered there. But the real horror was never the ghosts. The real horror was the living monster who once lived behind those elegant walls. But the real horror was never the ghosts. The real horror was not the screams people claimed to hear at night. It was not the shadowy figures said to wander past the windows. The true horror was far more terrifying because it was real. It had walked among the people of New Orleans in broad daylight, smiling gracefully, dressed in the finest silk, and adored by everyone. For years, one of the most beautiful, charming, and respected women in the city, Madame Delphine Lalaurie, had been secretly torturing and experimenting on living human beings in her attic, while the entire city worshipped her. She attended church every Sunday. She hosted extravagant balls where the richest and most powerful people in Louisiana danced and laughed under her crystal chandeliers. She was praised for her elegance, her manners, and her generosity. No one, not her neighbors, not her friends, not even her husband, suspected that behind those elegant walls, she had turned her attic into a private chamber of horrors. She treated human beings like laboratory animals. She cut them. She burned them. She broke their bones. She removed parts of their bodies. She kept pregnant women and then made their babies disappear. All of this while the city continued to call her charming, refined, and a true Southern lady. This is what makes the Lalaurie story so disturbing. Evil did not come wearing horns and carrying a pitchfork. It came wearing pearls, expensive perfume, and a warm smile. It hid behind wealth, social status, and beauty, until one 70-year-old enslaved woman named Leah made a choice that would change everything. Chained to a stove as the flames grew around her, Leah did not cry for help. She did not beg for mercy. Instead, she chose to start the fire herself. She chose to burn alive rather than return to that attic for even one more day of torture. Her single, desperate act of courage became the spark that exposed decades of hidden monstrosity. That fire did not just burn wood and furniture. It burned away the perfect mask that Madame Delphine Lalaurie had worn for decades, and finally revealed the monster hiding underneath. In the end, this story is much bigger than one cruel woman in New Orleans. It is a dark mirror held up to society itself. It forces us to ask difficult questions. How many monsters walk among us wearing the clothes of respectability? How often do we ignore the suffering of others because the person causing that suffering is rich, powerful, or beautiful? How long can evil hide when the whole society chooses to look away? Leah, an old enslaved woman with no power, no money, and no voice in the eyes of the law, showed more courage in her final moments than the entire city had shown in years. She proved that even the weakest person can become the spark that brings down an empire of lies. Her bravery reminds us that silence in the face of evil makes us complicit. Every person who attended Madame Lalaurie's parties, every person who praised her, every person who chose not to ask questions, they all played a small part in allowing that horror to continue. This is why stories like this matter. They are not just entertainment. They are warnings from history. They tell us that evil can wear the most beautiful face. They remind us that courage can come from the most unexpected places. And they teach us that no matter how powerful someone appears, the truth eventually finds a way to come out. sometimes through nothing more than an old woman's decision to light a match. Even today, when you walk down Royal Street in New Orleans and stand in front of that building, you can still feel the weight of what happened there. The mansion still stands. The ghosts may or may not be real, but the memory of what human beings did to other human beings inside those walls is very real. If you liked this story, and if it moved you in any way, if it made you angry, if it made you sad, or if it made you think, then please support me in making more long, detailed, and honest videos like this. You can buy me a cup of coffee using the link in the description of this video, or simply scan the barcode which is showing on your screen right now. Every single cup of coffee helps me continue researching, writing, and narrating these important hidden stories from history. This is not just a tale of one cruel woman. It is a powerful story about how evil can hide behind beauty, wealth, and high society. It shows us how one ordinary person's courage, even an old, powerless, enslaved woman, can expose even the darkest secrets. While old Jonah's story taught us about hope through songs, this one teaches us a much harsher lesson: that silence and admiration in the face of evil makes all of us complicit. True courage often comes from those the world considers the weakest. Thank you so much for listening to all 5 sections until the very end. I truly appreciate your time and support. God bless you, and I hope to see you in the next story.